Hello, everyone. Welcome to our another event from our newly established series of lectures where we discuss works of our EGS faculty members. And today's event is dedicated to two very exciting books of Professor Michael Naas about Don DeLillo. And today's participants are the author of these two books that are entitled Don DeLillo, American Original, and Apocalyptic Ruin and Everyday Wonder in Don DeLillo's America. Professor Michael Naas, professor of philosophy at DePaul University, where he teaches courses in philosophy and comparative literature, and conducts research in areas of ancient Greek philosophy and contemporary French philosophy, besides his translation work as well. Another participant is Christopher Fynsk, who you all well know, who is the Dean of the PAC Division and the President at the EGS, and excellent scholar of Heidegger and Blanchot. I want to use this opportunity to welcome for the first time at the EGS Professor Nicholas Royle. We are very honored to have you here for the first time at a certain event that is organized by the EGS. Professor Royle is the Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Sussex, and he is also a managing director of the Oxford Literary Review and director of Quick Fictions. Also, his most recent book, David Bowie, Enid Blyton and the Sun Machine, will be appearing in November 2023, and I hope that he will also give us the opportunity to discuss this book in a similar way, like we're doing with the books of Professor Naas. And finally, Tomislav Brlek is a professor at the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Zagreb. And he is one of the few people in the space of former Yugoslavia who successfully wrote on DeLillo's work. He also did it in English language. And if you want to check this out, please take a look at his text, Bordering on History, Rewinding the Past in Don DeLillo's Underworld. My name is Nemanja Mitrović. I work as the research fellow at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory in Belgrade. And before we start, I want to tell you that this event will be followed by another of this kind that will be on May 16th, where we will speak about the book of Professor Kevin McLaughlin, his book on Benjamin, the philology of life. And after this event with Professor McLaughlin, what we'll do is we're going to take a short break from this type of open lectures, but don't worry, the summer session at the EGS will start, and we're going to return to the to our format of evening lectures, where faculty members will present various papers. And all these events will be live streamed from SASVE. Concerning today's event, we will start with giving a certain amount of time to Professor Naas to tell us about his work. Then I'll give word to Professor Fynsk to pose his question. Then Professor Royle, then Professor Brlek. If there is something that remains for me, then I will jump in with my questions at the very end. And also, if there is enough time, there will be a possibility for the members of the audience to pose their questions. What we are planning to do is for the duration of this event to be approximately 2 hours. Professor Naas, thank you so much for being here virtually at the EGS again. And can you please tell us something about your two books on Don DeLillo?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Nemanja, for that presentation and for organizing this entire event. I'm incredibly grateful to you for doing it, and I'm really grateful to Chris, Nick, and Tomislav for being willing to respond to these works. I just want to take a couple of minutes maybe to give some context, and then just a little bit about the content of these two books. But I think the context for writing them is really important, because I had no intention of really writing a book on Don DeLillo. It was really the result of a very happy happenstance. I got invited by a scholar in France named Karim Danoun to give a paper on DeLillo in Paris. And I didn't want to pass up that opportunity. And I didn't want to tell Karim that, you know, I haven't written all that much on DeLillo, to be honest, up until the moment. But I'm very, very grateful for the invitation, and I'm going to take you up on it. So I took him up on the invitation. I have, for several reasons. One is that I've been reading Don DeLillo for a very, very long time, since high school. I read Americana in high school. And then as books would come out, I would hear about them maybe a year or two later and continue to read them. And then, of course, began following maybe in the 1990s. As soon as something came out, I would purchase it and read it. And that's still the case today. So I've been an avid reader of DeLillo for a very long time. But I don't consider myself, even now, a DeLillo scholar. So this was something of a hobbies, too weak a word, but something on the side of of my scholarship. And I say that with a bit of embarrassment, because these books are not typical scholarly books. Again, for a couple of reasons. I felt in a certain sense that the bar was incredibly high for engaging the critical literature on DeLillo. And it is an amazingly good series of commentators that work on in his work. For example, Nick's colleague, Peter Boxall, but then there's David Cowart and Franklin Tricchia and Mark Osteen and Lise Martucci and Jackie Zubik and Karim Danoun himself and Catherine Gander and Wendy Harding and Mark Schuster. And they've written about not all of the topics that I do, but many, many of the topics that I do. And I began thinking, there's no way I can begin engaging that enormous literature. That was one reason that these two books have, for those of you who have not seen them yet, and you might be shocked, no secondary sources and no footnotes. Part of it was the result of that feeling of incompetence before the secondary literature. But also, I wanted to do something different with these books. I wanted to speak more as the person I am, in other words, an enthusiastic reader rather than a scholar. So I think, and I wanted to try to convey some of the energy, the movement, and hopefully the humor of DeLillo's work. So that's the way I've organized, that's the reason why I've organized these books in the way I have. A series of very short 3 to 4 to 5 page chapters that follow a certain progression, but can nonetheless be read independently. One can jump around in these two books. And hopefully there's a kind of energy that gets created with each little short presentation of one of the themes that I treat. And I treat some 50 to 60 themes in each of the two books, so over 120 themes, I guess, in the two books together. I said that I had done little work on DeLillo up until this point, and that's true, but I hadn't written nothing. And it's interesting, the places where I had come to think about DeLillo. I had written up until 2016, when this invitation to go to Paris came. I'd written a chapter in a book called Derrida From Now On, where I look at DeLillo's Cosmopolis in relationship to Derrida's notion of autoimmunity, particularly in rogues. And I go back and forth between those two works throughout that chapter. And then there's another work that an essay that I wrote for the Oxford Literary Review, which Nick is a co-editor, on DeLillo's little novella, The Body Artist. And it had something to do with a change in editorship at the OLR. And I thought it was an appropriate, fascinating novel to look at in terms of thinking an old house, the Oxford Literary Review, being haunted by new members. And so that was the topic of the second essay. But then I also wrote a book called Miracle and Machine on the work of Derrida. And I decided, this was about 12 years ago, to interrupt my reading of Derrida on questions of science, religion, and the media with 4 brief chapters on DeLillo, all of them from Underworld, about questions of technology, and in particular, nuclear technology. So in this book too, then, in this chapter or in these chapters, I was going back and forth between Derrida's arguments relating to religion, science, and the media, particularly in a little essay that he published in 1995 called Faith and Knowledge, and then DeLillo's Underworld. So the whole idea of a kind of back and forth between philosophy and literature was already, for me at least, in place in this book called Miracle and Machine. When that invitation then came in 2016, I thought I would look then at this notion of going back and forth between philosophy and literature. And the name that I came up with, a name I didn't invent or even inflect in this way, is the term contraband. It's a term that Derrida himself uses, and uses it in one of the books that I think is a kind of model for this kind of back and forth writing, namely Glas, Derrida's 1974 Glas, which is a back and forth, a literal back and forth between two writers, two columns, at least the philosopher on the one hand, Hegel in the left-hand column, and Jean Genet on the other, in the right-hand column. I didn't want to imitate the structure of Glas by having two actual columns, but I did think it would be interesting to try to expand the notion of contraband in DeLillo's work, to begin with what we call literal contraband, the things that pass across borders illicitly. So drugs, weapons, nuclear weapons, pornography, all kinds of contraband in the most literal sense of the term. And then I wanted to argue that what makes Don DeLillo one of the great authors of our time, one of the most powerful and prescient writers, is his remarkable ability to juxtapose on every level, from the level of the greatest narrative to the sentence, all the way down to the word, at least 2, sometimes more than 2, nuances or tones, or in order to follow the notion of contraband, 2 narrative strains or bands, 2 bandwidths, as it were. And I find this to be a kind of key to thinking how DeLillo writes, how he structures his narratives, how he writes his sentences even, and even the words that he favors. So I realized it was, again, without secondary sources, there was something a little bit illicit and contraband in my own way of going about the process. But I wanted to try to show this notion of contraband at work in one way or another in, if I can put it this way, almost all of his works, from beginning to end, from Americana right through to, well, these books, the first book ends at 0K, and the second book is able to take into account the silence. So from Americana to 0K or to the silence, contraband is a kind of organizing principle in order to think DeLillo's back and forth of narrative, of writing, of sentences, of words, and so on. So that's the structure of and the motivation behind these 2 works. And then I hopefully we'll be able to talk about more specific aspects of these two works. I just wanted to give you some sense of where I was coming from and the general argument I was trying to make in these two works. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Naas. I would like now to give word to Professor Fynsk so that he can state his questions and comments.
Michael, thank you so much for agreeing to do this, for being present, and thanks to the other participants and everyone participating. It's wonderful to see the group that's assembled today. So thank you. I'm going to try to maybe operate a bit more of as a host than an interlocutor, because I'm certain that I'm the least qualified person in this group of discussions in terms of DeLillo and the I suppose the scholarly attention given to him. So I want to, with that note of modesty, I want to offer maybe a couple of remarks or questions that are sort of like softball questions, and that don't even amount to DeLillo's hardball. You know, this is a little bit short of DeLillo's style, I would say. But maybe I can get a curve in or two, you know, as I do this, just to make it interesting a little bit for you. So I just very quickly, I felt while I was reading the books, and even as you were just speaking, something which I will dare to call a false modesty, because I felt there was more going on than you allowed in your remarks. That this was a more sly practice of contraband than you quite acknowledged, and I admired it all the more for that, and I admired that in the text itself, while at the same time being in the text. Well, at the same time being led to ask myself about this, you know, it presented a real challenge to me to try to assess just how sly you were being, or how you know, how fugitive or whatever you were being, and so one of the first things that came up, your gesture of not pursuing a scholarly path by acknowledging the vast secondary literature. I thought to myself, this is just incredibly disruptive with regard to academic style, and I applaud it entirely. But it is quite disruptive, and I'll say that from the basis of someone who's been dealing with accreditation issues recently. And in the European Union, for example, I tried to argue that the EGS faculty are very distinguished. And I got back an answer from an external panel. This was back last year, and the end of the winter. Well, yes, but you don't really prove that objectively. And to do that, we need citation indices in order to show that you or Slavoj Žižek or Judith Butler are actually distinguished professors. And this was really quite astounding to me. I began to see a pattern in all of this, that it was a kind of an assault on traditional professional standards, a technicist assault, and it struck me as really quite aggressive. And so I applaud your gesture all the more of undermining that sort of spirit. Although I wonder if this gets carried very far, it could be quite subversive, because most EU academics are dependent on this system for their survival. So, and they didn't get cited in your book. So that's, and so I found it interesting, but I think it's very important. And I think this kind of experimentation and also your way of exploring, and I sense in these books, there's a kind of, I'm using, I guess maybe a French word, an essai, an exploration, you're pursuing a practice whose ends perhaps you're not fully certain of yourself, and trying out this concept of contraband, working with it, and frequently brilliant ways. I think Michael, you really reveal your ability as a reader. Again, in this context. You really bring out some the richness of passages in beautiful ways at many points. So I, as I was trying to assess this essay, I was, I was thinking a little bit about the structure between philosophy and literature that is at work. I mean, you are clearly smuggling a lot of philosophy into a work of literary criticism, at least certainly the first one where you're really going at the concept of contraband, and the second one is more summative, I suppose, thematically. But there is just a very, there's quite a lot of philosophical heavy artillery going on here, and yet very modestly proposed. And I would like to ask about that a little bit. I'd like to ask about what we might try to understand as the concept of the contraband, and whether it's a concept. I'm just not sure that I even want to press you on that, because what I see more is, like I say, an exploration, which is a practice of writing, and as opposed to any effort to conceptualize in a strong sense of introducing a masterful coherence, which would, in some sense, justify everything you try to pose, and instead of this way that you're proceeding of, trying out this concept, constantly using this notion in a very astute way. And I at the same time, you're not modest about some of your claims for this concept. I mean, it's or this word. You're using it to describe the structure of consciousness. You're using it to describe the paratactic structures in writing. You're using it to describe the relation between language and being, or humankind and being. And this is a if I could use the word concept, I would say this is a concept of relation. And maybe I'll even use, if I want to get pretentious, I'd use Benjamin. This is a Relationsbegriff. This is a concept that implies a rethinking of the notion of relation itself. And in that sense, I have to say, it really becomes quite fascinating and quite challenging. I mean, this is, in a certain sense, it really brings forth the challenge of deconstruction, it seems to me, and for philosophy, and maybe I'd say for phenomenology, because if I was correct before in saying that the contraband effect has something to do with consciousness itself and the temporality of consciousness. So it's and how we relate to the thing. You speak of the wonderful way in which things are illuminated at certain points. So it feels at certain moments like a phenomenological notion. But it seems to me that as you explore it, you really draw out much of its sort of deconstructive potential, and you start to explore it as a textual practice that's sort of working the limits of phenomenology in very fascinating ways. And so I guess my softball question is, is this inappropriate, what I'm proposing, that this is a rethinking of the concept of relation? And if you do accept that to some degree, would you want to say more about that? And of course, that's where the softball gets a little hardball, because that's a hard question. But I mean, for example, when I work a lot in the past couple of years with the notion of countering. I've done that actually for a very long time. But because I'm very attentive to Heidegger's notion of he'll use a phrase like the Gegeneinanderüber of poetry and philosophy. He'll place these modes of language usage over against one another, and going so far as to claim that in fact they need one another, that they cannot relate to their own ground without that relation. So that this becomes something much more than a juxtaposition. There is actually a much more active relation. But when Heidegger works with the notion of this in fact, he uses this Gegeneinander über of philosophy and literature to try to approach the question of the origin of language itself. And as he does that, then he starts to talk about how language gives us in its articulations the Gegeneinander über of all of the discourses of humanity, let's say, and the entire structure of the regions of world and sky and earth and humans and divine and so forth. But for Heidegger, this Gegeneinander über is an articulating, gathering, just those two words would be enough, an articulating, a joining, gathering principle. Whereas your contraband is extremely disruptive for any kind of structure like that. So that's my offer of a way, I think. I mean, not from my own work. That's one way that I would assess the power of this notion. But then maybe you want to hold to a more modest use of it. So that's my question to you.
Well, thank you. That's a fantastic question, and it's not the softball question. I don't think that you had suggested it might be. Let me just begin a couple of things that you said earlier, Chris, and you said so many important things for me. You talked in the beginning about my sort of false modesty and what exactly I'm doing here, and whether I'm more sly than I seem to be. I would like to think that one can hear, in a certain sense, my voice linking things together, making relationships between these passages. And yet I am on every page, I think, kind of hitching a ride on DeLillo's train, on DeLillo's New York subway car. I'm really getting the energy from his prose. So oftentimes I pick up on a particular phrase at the end of a quote, and then begin my sentence with the energy that I've gotten from that phrase. So I do want to continue to claim a certain modesty. My good friend Jeff Nealon, when he read the first of the two volumes, American Original, said that I was, and he didn't mean this as an insult at all. It was a compliment. He said I was curating DeLillo's work in a certain way. And I do think that that's the case. In other words, I'm trying to, I went back, I have to say, I went back and I had to read or reread or read the things I hadn't read, everything from starting in 2016 for a couple of years in order to make this work. And of course, as you begin to reread, you begin to create indexes and begin sifting things out and curating various topics, various quotes. And then the problem was what kinds of themes to choose. One of the problems is that DeLillo writes so well about so many themes, and he's so hilarious about so many themes that it's really difficult to leave anything out. So I did find myself as a kind of curator in many ways, trying to take the reader through the corpus, giving some indications about where to go for DeLillo on media, for example, television, films, photography, or art, from sculpture to painting, or DeLillo on technology, or DeLillo on language, or DeLillo on on miracles, DeLillo on science. I wanted to try to say a little bit about each one of those particular topics. And then this shouldn't replace in any way, and this comes to your point about citation, this shouldn't replace in any way, and it doesn't replace in any way, going to scholarly sources for more on any of those topics. I merely bring together a few quotes and make a few claims about the relationship between those quotes or passages. And I think it would be a good place to start. And then you go to David Coward's book on the physics of language, for example, something that I deal with in just a page or two. So curating, and then hopefully a kind of essay that will be helpful as a kind of source book. I think it's more than a lexicon, but it has an aspect of a kind of lexicon. So there's, I think, all of those aspects. As for contraband, is it a concept? I think if you're pushing me to say whether it is a concept in any kind of strong philosophical sense, then I'd obviously have to say no. It's a useful. Let me use a word that Derrida sometimes uses. It's a useful lever. It's a useful lever for revealing things in DeLillo's text. Sometimes with a little bit of violence on my part. Sometimes I'm forcing things. I recognize that just a bit. But I think it was incredibly useful as a lever in order to show and now you asked about the question of relation, the relationship, maybe in scare quotes or maybe not, I don't know, between two disjunctive things. And indeed, I think DeLillo does somehow argue in his writing that this is it's the structure of consciousness, particularly contemporary modern consciousness. So we find, for example, in DeLillo's most famous work, White Noise, you find a whole series of sort of 3 steps, Jack Gladney thinking about something having to do with Murray Ziskind, and then the next sentence has to do with clothes tumbling in the dryer. And then the very next sentence is something about the supermarket. So very disjunctive, but not at all, I think, unrecognizable to us as the way we think. Again, because this is not a scholarly work, I don't really talk about DeLillo sources. It's not something I know a lot about or could say a lot about, but clearly one of the sources for DeLillo's work has to be kind of stream of consciousness, the kind of writing you find in the Proteus chapter of Ulysses, for example, where Leopold Bloom is looking at everything on the beach, and we're moving kind of in a disjunctive way from one thought to the next. And you have to kind of figure out exactly how he made those connections. So there are connections. They might not always be absolutely visible, but there usually are connections. And when there aren't, I think that the disruption can nonetheless be read. That disruption can be read as a kind of Gegen, but maybe there's a kind of mit along with it. There's a kind of against, but also a kind of against in relationship. And that's what makes the power, it seems to me, of DeLillo's prose. Let me just stop there. I don't know if I...
No, that's a thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you.
And there's also a moment, there's, just to go back to your comment about consciousness, DeLillo's a thinker also of mirror images, duplicity, repetition, iteration. And this too is a kind of phenomenological insight. Oftentimes it takes the second or the third repetition for us to recognize the first, what the first was. So a kind of retrospective moment that doesn't simply recognize what was already there, but in a certain sense, a second or a third moment that that illuminates for the first time what was, in a certain sense, waiting to be illuminated. I don't want to say was already there, but was waiting to be thought, waiting to become present in a certain way.
Yes. Yeah, no, thank you. I could ask more questions. If we have time, I'll ask you. I have a little question about schematism, and with an example of a dog that I think is pertinent to what we're reading. But we'll maybe save that for another time or later. Nemanja, perhaps we should go on to Nicholas now. Thank you very much, Michael.
Yes, Professor Royle.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody, and a warm thanks to you for inviting me to this strange event, DeLillo-esque event, and the opportunity of talking to Michael. And I'm not sure quite how many questions I'm allowed to ask. But if I could perhaps stick to, I don't know, 4 maybe, to start us off with. I think just as a preliminary, I'd like to note that, and of course I do say this in one of the endorsements on the back of Don DeLillo, American Original. I do think that your work, Michael, or Michael's work, if I can talk about him in the third person, is of great pedagogical value. And that would be, for me, one of the ways I think in which I'd want to not necessarily justify, but at least give a certain kind of legitimacy to the kind of procedure, to what Michael is doing in these books, the ways in which he is, as it were, filtering out secondary criticism and suppressing other critical voices. I think there are definitely very positive dimensions to what he has done with these books. My first question is really, I suppose, just a kind of general invitation to you, Michael, to say something perhaps about the very idea of the book. I mean, I was quite struck when I received the invitation to talk here, wherever here is, whatever that means, about 2 books, and I haven't yet actually got my hands on a material copy of the second book, so I've been dependent on a PDF. This makes a big difference to me, and I wonder if it doesn't also make a difference to Don DeLillo. And I wonder if you'd be able to say a little bit about the, I guess, you know, it's a question that is troubling all of us, but the future of the book, as it were, and DeLillo's place in thinking about the book as book.
Yeah, that's, go ahead. No, sorry, Nick.
Yeah. So that's really the first question. Not it's a big, you know, soft question, as Chris would say. You know, partly mindful of, you know, work that's been appearing in the last year or two, like Brian Cummings' Bibliophobia, I suppose. And anyway, just a general question about the book. And then my second question, I suppose, is about your, not so much the way in which these books choose not to engage with other critics on DeLillo, but more about the manifest methodological decision that you've made not to write about Jacques Derrida. So, you know, I'm curious about what it's like for you not writing about Jacques Derrida. You know, the sense perhaps that in some ways there's a liberation, but then also the question of, I mean, Chris was touching on this, I think, when he was referring to how philosophically freighted the writing is, what it really means not to write about Jacques Derrida. So books these 2 books are very different from Miracle and Machine and from now on, Derrida from now on, in which DeLillo figures. something quite different is going on in the way in which you are writing, and I'm curious about the what that's enabled you to do, how you think about the sort of liberty, whether it is a liberty, and perhaps linked to that, you know, the question of humor, because you kind of emphasized humor in your remarks at the beginning, and the importance for you of trying to capture something about the humor of DeLillo's writing. I think you and I, and perhaps many listening, are very appreciative of humor in Derrida. And I'm curious about the relationship between DeLillo's humor and Derrida's, whether you could say something about that. My third question, is it okay to go on like this? Can I ask a couple more, formulate a couple more questions? So the third question is about, I suppose it's something that that appears in the subtitle of your first book on DeLillo, which is the word erotica. And erotica is clearly not the same as pornography. And I you know, it'd be a very different book, it seems to me, if the subtitle had the word pornography in it rather than erotica. And I wonder if I could invite you to say something about the erotic, the place of the erotic in DeLillo and in your reading of DeLillo. And linked to that, I guess there's a question about the figure of woman, and you know, I'm rather aware here of the you know, there's a British word which you are very familiar with, I'm sure, a bloke, and the adjective blokish, and I'm somewhat sort of awkwardly, self-consciously aware of the blokishness of our the makeup of our seminar. I wonder about the figure of woman in DeLillo, and how that perhaps figures in your appreciation of DeLillo's work. The final question is really, I suppose it's about the most recent, or I'm not sure whether it is the most recent DeLillo book, but the book called The Silence. And when you talk about the silence in Apocalyptic Ruin, you don't talk about Derrida, but you do have an epigraph from Derrida. So it's the only place, I think, in Apocalyptic Ruin and Everyday Wonder where Derrida appears by name, if I'm not mistaken. So this is in an epigraph to the conclusion, and you have a quotation from the postcard. What cannot be said, above all, must not be silenced, but written. And I would like to invite you to say more about this silence. And I suppose sort of in passing, I'd like to say, I mean, I wasn't sure whether how much, you know, my reading of the silence might accord with yours, but personally, I found it quite a disappointing little book. You know, I mean, I was not knocked out by it in the way that I am knocked out by Point Omega or The Body Artist. Yeah, I'm curious about the definite article, The Silence, and what you think about the silence.
Thank you, Nick. Wow, those are amazingly good and difficult questions, all four of them. Maybe I'll begin at the end, with the silence. So yes, I mean, is the silence one of DeLillo's great works? Really not. I sort of dance around the question of the repetition of themes in the silence at the very beginning of my conclusion, where I say that not so great writers repeat themselves in unproductive ways, and great writers repeat themselves in interesting and very productive ways. DeLillo's clearly in the latter category, though it does seem as if the silence, there are a lot of strange holes in the narrative. You are expecting more. It's 116 slim pages. And maybe that will link back to your first question about the book in a moment. So it's really a novella size rather than the novel size. But, the more I looked at it, the more I found in it. Obviously, I tried to see it as being a kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say a culmination, but it's clearly a work that feels like it's coming at the end, near the end of a career, and it summarizes. It gives an account, in a certain sense, of earlier works. So what do we find in it? I mean, literally, the entire book, the second book, was written when The Silence came out. And as I was able to write a postface that said, isn't it interesting that almost every theme that I've talked about thus far in the book is mentioned in some way, is some way part of The Silence. So travel, air travel, and it's the Tessa Barons and Jim Cripps are coming back from Paris on Super Bowl weekend 2022. So questions of travel, questions of going in between continents, since many of DeLillo's books have a kind of contraband quality by going back and forth, not just between two narrative strands in the same place, which can happen, for example, in Dele Plaza in Libra, two narrative strands that are taking place in the same place, but two narrative strands that are taking place in two different cities, or two narrative strands that are taking place in two very different places, like aboard a 747 returning from Paris and in the Upper East Side apartment of Max and his wife. So there's already travel, air travel. There's games, sports. So it's Super Bowl Sunday. It's a book, in a certain sense, a novella about football, just like End Zone is. So it feels like this kind of a tip towards End Zone. There are reflections about war and peace and the apocalypse. There's obviously a lot to say about technology. So for those of you who read that book, you know that something happens that we don't quite know what it is, but the electrical grid goes down just as the Super Bowl is getting started, and we're left with 5 characters, kind of a play-like setting. The 2 people who have the apartment on the Upper East Side, the couple that has just returned from Paris to Newark, gotten into a plane crash and miraculously made it out with just a scrape or 2, had sex. So that's the answer to your third question, in the waiting room at Newark Airport, waiting to get an ambulance or some kind of car to take them into the city, where they'll then walk up to the Upper East Side to watch the game. So there is that kind of contraband aspect of travel, and then there's the aspect of technology. There's the notion of apocalypse. But then in the end, what is The Silence about? I think it's about the relationship between language and silence. It's about the relationship between language and what is at the edge of language, or what comes before language, or what is the source of language. And it seems to me that DeLillo's arguing here, it's a certain silence. So even though even though the pretext is a little strange and one doesn't make it to a Super Bowl party 2 hours after having been in a crash of a 747 at New York airport, apart from all of the strangeness in terms of the narrative itself, what we're left with in the end are 5 characters who will, as in a play, take leave of the audience one by one with a kind of closing monologue. First, I think it's Diane Lucas, who's a physics teacher, who's the wife of Max, and then there's Max, and there's a student of Diane named Martin Decker, and then there are the 2 people that just came back from Paris, and each one of them adds some different aspect to the relationship between language and silence, it seems to me. I mentioned Joyce. It is very interesting that Joyce is prominent in Americana. It's the author that's cited most, 5 or 6 times in Americana. DeLillo mentions him in a couple of interviews. And then, as far as I can tell, there are no explicit, maybe they're implicit references to Joyce throughout most of DeLillo's work. And then all of a sudden we find in the silence a line from Finnegan's Wake. Clearly, not bizarrely, not the word, which I would have expected, the word in parentheses, silence, which is actually, I think it's even capitalized in parentheses. I think it's 1066 or 1132, silence, 1132, 1066. And then there's another very famous line about silence in Finnegan's Wake. Not that line, but this line. Ere the Saxon locked at the door, which I'm not exactly sure what it means, but I try to parse it a little bit as something like before the Saxons with their socks on locked or knocked at the door. I think DeLillo's referring to the origin of the English language. I think he's talking about what happened when the Saxons came to England, and there was the beginning of a kind of beginning of the English language. So I think there's lots of interesting things, and we can talk about the ending. I was very, very surprised by the ending of the silence. So I try to argue in the second book that DeLillo's endings almost always have a moment of some kind of a miracle of some kind, almost always related to language, but oftentimes concomitantly related to an astrological event, such as an eclipse, a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse. Either some relationship between the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon, those 3 circular objects. And the miracle of some sort will oftentimes have to do with some round thing too, like an orange in Underworld, the miraculous apparition of Esmeralda Lopez on the billboard in the Bronx, or Wilder on his tricycle in White Noise. It's always something, some kind of, DeLillo was, I think, born Catholic and went to Fordham University for a while. Some kind of Trinity being evoked, even if it's a sort of ironic Trinity. So I was surprised not to find it there, not to find tricycle, not to find an eclipse, to find Max Stenner sitting in front of his TV, which has no sound coming out of it, even though it's turned up to the max. No sound coming out of it, there's no image. But then I started thinking about what he's doing. What he's doing is he goes like this at the end of the silence. And I realized, that's the triangle. This is the triangle. He's clasping his hands behind his head. And that's the kind of triangle that suggests he's open and ready for what comes next, for some kind of signal that maybe from the television or maybe elsewhere. And, in the old days, we would use a kind of coat hanger shaped like this in order to get a signal on an old television. I think that's what DeLillo's doing at the end of The Silence, which I think a pretty interesting and clever thing to have done. Maybe I can just jump from that to your first question, because this slender little book, it's 116 pages. It's not just a small book with large font and large margins, but they seem to have reproduced, whether actually reproduced or mocked it up, I'm not sure. It's the reproduction of a typewriter script, where certain letters are even more strongly imprinted than others. As far as I know, DeLillo still writes with a typewriter. I believe that that's the case. I don't know if it's the Panasonic of white noise still, but I think he still writes with a typewriter. And so he certainly is he's a writer of the book. He's a thinker of many different technologies that come after the book, including the internet, where he asks at the end of Underworld, in a certain sense, whether the internet is in the world, or whether we can begin to think of the world as being in the internet. In a certain sense, the Underworld ends in the internet, in a certain sense, as Nick Shea out in Phoenix, Arizona, is searching around for images of atomic bombs going off, and searches then at the very end for the word peace in various languages. So he's a thinker of contemporary technologies, a thinker of the internet, but it does seem to me that he's a writer of the book, still writing with a typewriter. And this leads me to, at that Paris conference, DeLillo was at that conference, and he gave a talk, and someone asked him about not quite this aspect, but a similar aspect of his writing. And he said something which is really kind of unimaginable. He said something like, I began typing, and depending upon the size of the word, or the ink, or the letter itself, or the impression it makes on the page, things start coming out of the page itself. Buildings. I think he talked about buildings, the buildings of 0K, of the convergence, started coming off of the page in a certain sense, in a way that I can't quite grasp. It was rather cryptic in his description. But it did suggest a kind of practice of writing whereby he has a certain sense of what he's writing, and then the physical activity and the material of the written page itself begin having a kind of feedback loop. That's the way I understood it. And he begins writing and thinking differently as a result of the words that he now sees imprinted on the page. Do we get that from writing on a laptop? I don't know, but I think DeLillo's pretty beholden to his typewriter, it seems to me. So those are the just a couple of comments about those, your first question and the last one. As for not writing about Derrida, in a strange way, it was surprisingly easy, and it was, yes, you said liberating. In many ways it was, because it allowed me to use a kind of voice or American idiom that I don't use when I'm writing about Derrida, or rarely do I use, because it seems inappropriate. But here it seemed very appropriate to be able to deploy the resources of my own American idiom in writing about DeLillo. And that was a lot of fun. I was able to use kind of slang words that I wouldn't use in typical academic writing. So yes, it was liberating in many ways. And it's that American idiom that I think lends itself to the humor. One can certainly, one doesn't have to be American to hear it, but it certainly helps. It certainly helps, obviously, to be able to hear the nuances of many of these words, phrases, sentences, and so on, and idioms. As for the question of women, yeah, that's a big question, because you use the word bloke. There, I think, is the thought, and maybe in early novels this is not inaccurate, that there is a kind of blokishness to certain characters in DeLillo's work. You were talking about our panel, but in DeLillo's, where the main characters are usually male. David Bell in Americana, though there are some very strong and interesting female characters in Americana too. Endzone is mostly men or adolescents, boys in college. Running Dog players, mostly men. Then you begin thinking about the really interesting exceptions. And I must say that when The Body Artist came out, I'd be curious to see what others thought about that particular novel. The main character, Lauren Hartke, fascinating character, and it's a fascinating novel, and it really seems to, DeLillo's prose, to me at least, change in that novel. It's recognizably DeLillo, but it's a very different kind of writing. Yeah. And then, of course, there are strong, interesting female characters, women characters in Underworld and elsewhere. So I think the blokishness has been tempered in several last novels. I think I answered most of your questions. Can I just say one thing in response to Nick? I've been reading Nick's work for a long time, and as well, and recently for another occasion. And Nick is a great writer of the telephone. And Nick, somewhere in The Guardian, once published an article about the 10 great writers of the telephone, from Proust to Hélène Cixous. I don't know if I would put DeLillo on that list as number 11, but he's got some interesting things to say about the telephone, some really interesting things to say about the telephone. So I would just add him to, if you had an expanded list, I would add DeLillo to that list. But anyway, thank you, Nick, for those comments. If you wanted me to follow up on anything, I'd be happy to.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yeah, I mean, I would love to follow up on some of the things that you've said, but perhaps that should happen later, should it? Yeah, I mean, I've got a connection with Chris's dog. Maybe there's a way of coming back to that later on, but okay. I'll leave it for now. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Royle. Tomislav, would you like to ask your questions now?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I'm obviously the odd man out in this company in more ways than one, but I'll try to pose a question eventually, I think. But first, there are a couple of things. There are many things of great interest that have come up in the course of this conversation. So I hope this makes some kind of sense in the end. But when speaking about the American idiom, you said how it enabled you to write more in the humorous vein, or if I got that right. And I think it's very pertinent to DeLillo, if not the most important thing about it. It's no accident that he begins Underworld with "He speaks in your voice, American." Mm-hmm. It's an American voice, whereas of course DeLillo writes; he does not speak. And I think that this has to do with the issue of silence that was also mentioned, because the one thing that writing cannot do is be silent. I mean, you cannot be, a person can be silent. A film can do it. For example, you can have a film, and of course there is a famous film by Ingmar Bergman called The Silence, Tystnaden. But in film you can be silent, but a narrative cannot be silent. It can describe silence, it can describe characters, but narrative itself cannot be silent, of course. And I think that's what you said about what the silence is about is absolutely right. It is that which is beyond, before, after, on the edge, off stage to language, but even more so to writing, because it's and so I think I've always thought of DeLillo as a writer very interested in exploring things that cannot be done in other media, but only in writing. I think that DeLillo is very interested in film, but I would say that his novels do not film well, for a very good reason, because they seem to have been written by excluding almost everything, or most of the things that you can actually translate into film. And that brings me to the issue of humor. I don't know what the others think about the recent film of White Noise, but I was terribly disappointed. I did not expect much, but I was disappointed nevertheless, precisely because it lacked this one essential quality about DeLillo's writing, for me at least, is that with every single sentence, you're never really sure how seriously you should take it. Whether the character, the narrator, the text itself is putting you on, or is being absolutely serious. I think that ambiguity in that respect is absolutely crucial to DeLillo, and I did not see it in that film, interestingly enough, except in one single scene. When Barbara Sukova appears and speaks in German, I got that from that you were not really sure whether you should take her character who speaks in. It's not about German versus English. It's about the way she acts. I think that she managed somehow to convey this idea that at the same time she's terribly serious and completely joking, which I think is something that the rest of the film doesn't get anywhere near to, in my opinion, anyway. And this, to bring this to an end, brings me to the end of philosophy and literature. I wonder what you mentioned Wittgenstein on several times in the books, and there is this one statement by Wittgenstein which cannot really, is difficult to translate. Philosophie dürfte man eigentlich nur dichten. Now, dichten is not, of course, to poeticize, but it's been rendered in various ways. But I think that's also quite pertinent to DeLillo, that he is also interested in philosophy, but again, in the things that you can do in a novel that you cannot do in a philosophical treatise, and the other way around. And of course, Derrida is the one writer who's navigated this in various ways. But even Derrida is, I got that from your books, I would say, about DeLillo, which I don't really get from many other books on DeLillo. However, important and useful they are in other respects. I got that playfulness, which is not, which is by no means a drawback. No, it's a positive advantage. This playfulness and this intellectual, serious play of the intellect, shall we say, in which probably the more conventional system of dealing with secondary sources would have prevented. I don't know, but it's something that Derrida does all the time. I think. Mm-hmm. I think Derrida's writing on literature it's not underestimated, it's not ignored, but it's not given its due. I think Derrida is a great writer about literature precisely because he does not impose even his own philosophy on the literary text, but plays with the text and allows the text to, what you've been describing at the beginning as your own procedure, like taking DeLillo's phrase and then riffing on it as it. I'm simplifying now, but something to that effect. So, yes, thank you very much. I would like to, well, as I said, there is no real question except maybe this issue of DeLillo being a writer of something that can only be written and not filmed, not staged, not presented in other ways.
Tomislav, thank you very, very much. Those really terrific comments. I think I agree with everything that you have said. You began by quoting that line, the first line of Underworld. He speaks in your voice, American, which you're absolutely right. That was it's the in a certain sense the American idiom that attracted me to DeLillo, and that allowed, as I said to Nick, the kind of freedom of language that I feel in a different way. Put it this way when I'm writing about Derrida. But it occurs to me that phrase too, he speaks in your name, in your voice, American. It's also self-reflective in a way. It's that DeLillo himself speaks in your voice, American. And that leads me to the first line of the silence. So the first line of the silence is, and we understand this again after the fact, we understand that this is a sentence that's being conceived, perceived, written by the two passengers aboard the flight from Paris to Newark. So the very first sentence is words, sentences, numbers, distance to destination. So a book about the silence, you're exactly right, begins with the word words. So it begins with the very things that seem to go against silence, or at least perhaps emerge out of silence. And then by the end of that first fragment, we have words that are being read by the reader, but also being read by Jim Cripps and Teresa Behrens on their screen. So first, it's a description of the screen, words, sentences, numbers like number of degrees Celsius outside. But then distance to destination is a phrase that's being read by them. So that's interesting that the very process of writing and reading is being put on display in that very first sentence, it seems to me. So yes, that brings us to the kind of confrontation between the Wittgenstein and the Derrida quote that Nick mentioned. What cannot be silent, what cannot be said must especially not be silenced, but written. I think DeLillo completely would endorse that particular line. It must be written. And I think that goes in the direction of your comments about the difference between writing and film, things that can only appear in writing and can't be filmed. And I'm going to have make a confession here about the latest version of White Noise. It's a hackneyed thing to say. It's even worse than saying I didn't like the film as much as the book. It's even worse than that. I began it, and after 30 seconds of the watching, I like Don Cheadle, but that he was not conveying precisely the humor of Mari Ziskind in that opening scene about the car crashes and great American pastime of watching car crashes. I didn't hear any of the humor, so I stopped. And I stopped because I wanted to preserve, I think I have a very clear Mari Ziskind voice from White Noise, though also from Amazon's, where he also appears. I have a very clear Mari Ziskind voice, and I didn't want to ruin it. And I thought that I would start ruining all of my characters' voices if I kept on watching the movie. So I really can't judge it beyond those first 30 seconds. And that leads to, I think you're pointing to a really interesting paradox, because at a certain point in American Original, I somehow argue, and I think there's something right about it, that DeLillo's narrative technique borrows from film technique in terms of jump cuts. So what I was talking earlier in terms of disruptive narrative movements, they could be thought of as jump cuts. And yet, even though this writing seems to borrow so much from some film technology in a certain sense, it seems to resist filming in ways that many authors don't, or not to this extent. I did watch Cosmopolis all the way through. Little bit, I liked certain aspects of it. But once again, I had a hard time watching insofar as the voice, which is very unique, of Eric Pecker, seemed to be not the voice that I heard. Again, a very common thing to say about novels that are made into films, but I think it's really the case of DeLillo's works. So those are just a few thoughts. I am grateful that you said that you thought that I was trying to follow the playfulness / seriousness of DeLillo. And you're absolutely right to say that it's hard to know. It's hard to know whether to take a particular sentence seriously or playfully, or somehow both. That's oftentimes the case. I do say in one of the earlier chapters of American Original on this, I'm trying to develop this notion of contraband, that one clue, it seems to me, comes from White Noise, where Babette's father is visiting, and he's got this long litany of things that are going wrong with them. And he says to Babette, don't worry about the fact that I'm coughing, that I smoke 3 packs a day. There's nothing to worry about, the unexpected weight loss. It's the car you should be worried about. The car I'm giving you, the wheels are bald, and the hood that jumps up when you go over potholes. And then Babette says, and he said it deadpan. So there's this kind of deadpan to DeLillo's writing where we don't quite know how to interpret what has just been said retrospectively. Is it funny? Is it serious? Is it both? There's a kind of deadpan that covers much of DeLillo's writing, I think. So thank you very much for those comments.
Tomislav, do you have something else, or I can jump in with?
No, go ahead.
Thank you. So it's great for me that I have the opportunity to pose several of my questions, because for so many years I'm a big fan of DeLillo's writings, and I enormously enjoyed reading these 2 books, precisely because of this thing that Tomislav described, and also because I believe that I felt a certain passion of yours that you had while writing these books, that you wrote these books as someone who is a really big fan and admirer of DeLillo's prose. So there is this feeling that I had while I was reading your books. And what Tomislav said was really interesting, because that was something that I also wanted to ask, because it is really interesting that even his screenplay, Game 6, cannot be translated into a film that is this is a good film. It's not the one with Michael Keaton. But since this is already mentioned, I want to proceed to ask you something that was very interesting to me about contraband, because you mentioned that it is in Derridian terms lever, not a concept. And there is one point in your book where you described contraband as irony and self-reference, which enables you to connect contraband with the postmodernist literature in general, especially American metafiction, American postmodernism. If you do this, I just wanted to ask, and now we're getting close to think of contraband as a concept, can we think of contraband as a feature not only of DeLillo's prose, not only of postmodernism, but about contraband in literature in general? And since I know that you're also teaching and writing about ancient literature, can we think about contraband in ancient Greek literature? Is it possible to do that?
Wow, what a terrific question. It's going to take. I'm not going to be able to answer that question. It's coming completely out of the blue in the best of ways. So I thank you very much for that, Nemanja. So can you imagine? Well, the question would be where it would be located. I have a hard time imagining, for example, a kind of double meaning sentence or phrase coming out of the mouth of, let's say, Agamemnon or Achilles or Odysseus or Hecuba. I'm not sure about that. There are double entendres or at least there are relationships between words that have two meanings, for example, that Homer sometimes uses as he's stitching the various narratives together. But that seems to be different than contraband. For example, in Book 9 of the Iliad, we're no doubt supposed to hear in the background, we're supposed to hear, for example, that the name Patroclus it has an echo in the name Cleopatra, spoken by, I think it's Nestor in the embassy scene when he's trying to convince Achilles to return to the war. So there's that double meaning. It's never, or not a double meaning, but a reversal of Patroclus's name that's kind of operating below the surface. That's the closest thing I can think of off the top of my head to something that then disrupts to a certain extent. So maybe I'm coming back here to arguing for a kind of contraband that could disrupt the things that are said explicitly about Patroclus because of that reference to a woman, Cleopatra, in the story of Nestor, and that's made. That's given way to a whole literature about the relationship, homoerotic or not, between Achilles and Patroclus, or Patroclea or Cleopatra. So there's that. I'm not sure it's exactly the same thing. So I have a hard time. Is it something modern? Is it something postmodern? There's kind of irony, certainly. And I do think that there is irony in DeLillo, and it's a unique brand of irony, but it's a kind of irony. I think you find that irony in many other writers. I don't know if it's a hallmark necessarily of the postmodern, but you find a good deal of it. So I'm not sure whether how far I want to expand the notion of contraband. For the moment, I'm restricting it to DeLillo's work, and I'm trying to find it operating at all of these different levels. As I said, so just to give some sense here, at the level of the narrative, for example, take Falling Man. We have two narrative strands. We have the people in the tower, in the South Tower. Keith Neudecker, who has survived the crashing of the plane on 9/11. We have that narrative. And then we have the narrative of Mohammed Atta. in Hamburg training to become terrorists, going to Florida. And we go back and forth between those two narrative strains, chapter by chapter, back and forth, until all of a sudden, sort of in the middle of the novel, we're in the plane with Mohammed Atta. He's watching a bottle roll on the aisle of the plane that's about to strike the South Tower. And as he's watching that bottle roll down the aisle, there's the impact. And now we're in the South Tower with Keith Neudecker. So that the two narratives collide there. And it's a brilliant and extraordinary orchestration of those two narratives that have been contrabanded and then come together. Libra is an even more complicated because there are even more narrative strands. We've got the Oswald strand, and then we've got the various CIA operative strands, and they come together at obviously those 6 seconds of heat in Dallas. They come together in Dealey Plaza during the assassination of Kennedy. So that's at the macro level. But then I've tried to give examples of, for example, the contrabanding of personal perceptions and things you see in the world, as you would find in the Proteus chapter of Ulysses, but as I tried to say in White Noise, Jack Gladney thinking about Murray Ziskin, but then he sees something on the television and then a line about the supermarket. So at the level of the sentence structure, there's the notion of contrabanding. And then I want to even think that even individual words, there are DeLillo marked words that seem to always have two aspects, one nuancing or contrabanding the other. Words like looming. A word like looming always suggests that there is something looming and something being loomed over. Or festering. Festering seems to suggest something that's not yet apparent. There are several, and they come up over and over. You can find looming in almost every novel, as well as festering and several others. So, or foreboding. Foreboding's another good one. The notion of a horizon, something on the horizon, is a phrase that you'll find often in a DeLillo novel. Anyway, Nemanja, so let me just give it back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, this was the answer. So I apologize because of some of my questions are direct, because one of the reasons why I adore DeLillo already is because when I was a kid, I was completely immersed in the American culture. So all this time, I was able, country opened up, so I was able to watch Showtime of LA Lakers and TV, all these American sports, American films and the stuff. So when he is writing about this stuff, this is something that are basically things that I was growing up with, this American mythology and American idiom, that is. And my next two questions are related to, and I will stop after these two questions, are related to something that is being mentioned in your title, that is American original. So they're related to American originality and American idiom that is being mentioned. So I'm interested, why you chose precisely that title, that saying Don DeLillo American original, because I'm thinking about his place in the American literature, especially in the American literature of this period. Because for me, when I was reading all this, DeLillo always goes in pair with Donald Coover, because they're dealing with very similar topics. It is the postmodernist baseball, which is also very prevalent in Coover's work, which is American football. Coover and whatever happened with Gloomy Gus of Chicago Bears. Cinema, like cinema in Star Valley and all this stuff that are showing up in DeLillo's work, and Night at the Movies in Coover. So I'm interested, and also you present a very rework the notion of originality in your writings on DeLillo. But I'm wondering, can you tell me what makes precisely Don DeLillo American original?
Well, you caught me there, I think, Nemanja, because that was not my original title was Don DeLillo's Contraband, and Bloomsbury didn't think that was a particularly attractive title, and so I got pushed, not without consent. I agreed to Don DeLillo American Original. Obviously, as you very rightly said, the notion of originality has to be, in a certain sense, thought in relationship to the subtitle, because it's a kind of originality that comes through a kind of contraband, or it's an originality that constructs itself through contraband, and it's originality that I think didn't come to itself or come into itself completely alone. I mentioned Joyce, but I mean, there's Beckett, there's Kafka, there are many other authors, no doubt, in the background. Coover, Coover's interesting. I don't know if I've ever seen. Yes, Coover's often mentioned with DeLillo, as is Pynchon, for example. Pynchon's maybe a less good example, except for a novel like Ratner's Star, where there's a kind of Pynchon-esque quality to Ratner's Star. Yeah, I don't know. I think I would want to go back to what we were talking about earlier. There are no doubt other American writers who write about America in a unique way, but for me, DeLillo writes about American themes. We haven't really talked about that yet, but every novel takes place in the US, either in part or in whole, except for the names, I think that's right. Many of them take place in New York City, but many of them take place in New York City plus something, New York City plus the desert, so Point Omega, New York City plus Canada, Players, New York City plus Phoenix and California, Underworld. So it's American setting, American themes, it seems to me. Guns, we haven't talked about that, but gun violence in America is a very, very, and violence in general in America. Football in End Zone. And then, of course, not just guns, but weapons, weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. America has a lot of them. And DeLillo is one of the thinkers, it seems to me, who thinks the most about the stockpile of weapons and the technology that we are all relying upon to control them. He's probably the best thinker, it seems to me, of how to think this kind of the looming threat, which has been with us since the Second World War, of these megaton bombs. And that's not just in Underworld, where obviously there's a lot about nuclear weapons in Underworld, but already in End Zone. Gary Harkness goes to a motel room to meet with an ROTC recruiter, and they play war simulation games where they go back and forth, imagining what would happen if a nuclear attack were launched in Europe, et cetera. And then I've got all the way up to Zero K, where we have this, and I'm not sure this is postmodern, but this is unique and quite interesting. In the convergence itself, Jeffrey Lockhart finds himself in the convergence, and it seems like what's being presented to him along a wall is a kind of a montage of all of the great world wars of this century, of the 20th century, until he sees and this is what, 2020, I guess, until he sees something that's happening in the present. And it's his girlfriend's son named Stack, who's living with him and the girlfriend in New York City. And he's left home at the age of 15. And he sees him on the screen fighting and dying in Ukraine. And so to bring DeLillo's novel right into the present, he watches him die in Ukraine at the age of 15 with a Kalashnikov in his hand. So yeah, that's a number of reflections about the originality of DeLillo. And he will have treated, he will have treated a lot of the great American events from the Second World War, Vietnam War to some extent, 9/11, the Kennedy assassination, the first Gulf War, and then in the silence, this apocalyptic event that has no name, no clear origin.
So for my final question, and this one is related to one of the themes that you mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, and Chris will forgive me because this is one of the themes that is so dear to me. It's the theme of sport that features prominently in DeLillo, and especially not sports in general, but the theme of American football. That I have to admit, I adore watching American football. I'm watching it since I was a kid, and the theme of sport in secondary literature of Don DeLillo is usually being treated from the cultural point of view. So it is the position of sport in postmodernist society and so on. But what I really love in your book, that you point to something that is very different in Don DeLillo, and it is that question of language. American football has its own code. It is a code, and it is a code that is actually a power, and it is a conjuring power of language. Because what you hear are terms in Don DeLillo's prose that come from the American football, that is, for example, snap, shotgun formation, line of scrimmage, all these terms that if you don't know them, you actually don't know what is happening on the ground. And these terms, through the calls, are actually conjuring actions and conjuring events that are happening on the field. These terms are now become to something that Tomislav said are uniquely American idiom. And especially for someone who is a non-native speaker of English, and I'm coming back to my previous question, when I was reading Don DeLillo's prose and his writings on sports, not only Puff Guedo, but that small New Yorker piece that is Game Plan, that he describes a college game, these were the moments when I was hearing that American voice that is being mentioned. So it was, is sports something, the topic of sports, actually a valuable theme for him because it actually enables him to speak in that American voice?
I think so. I think it's maybe not the only topic that allows for that, but it's certainly one of the main ones. You're absolutely right. So you mentioned sports and the code that goes along with each sport, the entire vocabulary that goes around it, that grows up around it. And I was thinking of the very famous passage in Underworld where Father Paulus takes the young Nick Shea and says, if you don't know the words of things, you won't be able to see the things themselves. And he said, give me your shoe. And he takes his shoe and he says, what's this part called? It's called the tongue. It's interesting that one of the parts of a shoe is called a tongue, so it's already related to language. And then he points to a whole bunch of parts of the shoe that he doesn't know the names of, and he says, well, you'll never see these things if you don't learn the names. You're suggesting to me that there's something to be said for learning the names for line of scrimmage and so forth. I think you're exactly right. You can't understand the sport or see the things without knowing those names. And then there's the aspect, so there's the aspect of the code that one finds in sports. And then there's the whole phenomenon of broadcast, of narrating or announcing sports. And that seems to be almost one of the primordial ways that DeLillo thinks narration. I think he imagines himself, in a certain sense, as being a kind of writerly Russell Hodges, the announcer for the Giants during that 1951 Polo Grounds game. And to justify that, you find characters doing the very same thing that Russell Hodges does. For example, Bill Gray in Mao 2 says he goes to sleep at night. When he can't sleep at night, he runs through the starting lineup of the, I forget, I don't know if it's the Giants or the Yankees, but he runs through the starting lineup of his favorite team. And he begins to announce. And in the silence, so the silence, again, brings these things together. In the silence, once the TV goes silent, Max, who ends up like this, but whose name is also constructed of all of those, those V-like forms. And I'm sure that when DeLillo was typing the word Max, he saw all those, those triangular forms. Max begins broadcasting the game himself, including advertisements. So he begins broadcasting the game in mock fashion. It's not on the screen anymore, along with advertisements. So I think that is the kind of, it's a model of what a certain narration is. And it comes, you're exactly right, from sports announcing. And of course, we only have traces of that famous home run on October 3rd, 1951, from Russell Hodges' famous narration and someone capturing it on a tape recorder. The Giants have won the pennant, the Giants have won the pennant. That kind of very famous phrase comes from an announcer who becomes a kind of figure of the author, therefore.
So, thank you so much. These were my questions. So we still have some time left. So maybe if Professor Royle, who has some more questions, maybe you want to ask some of them, or maybe we want to give the chance to some members of the audience to pose their questions if they have them. What do you prefer, Professor Royle?
Well, I'm happy to say something else, but I don't want to stop others from posing questions or remarks if they'd like to. I don't know, perhaps we should find out first whether there are people in the audience who would like to say something.
So you can, the members of the audience, you can signal to us by raising the virtual hand if you have some questions.
Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, okay, well, let me perhaps just draw on one or two things that have been said in the course of this session, and particularly perhaps about the voice, because I think the remarks that were made about the kind of singularity of DeLillo as writing very resonant for me. And one of the things that I really love about DeLillo is, and I can talk about this in relation to a word, okay, and you probably know what that word is, Michael.
Is with a V?
The word, yeah, the word veer, or the word veering, which is, you know, something that pushed me into writing an entire book on the subject. But it seems to me that veering is an extraordinarily rich and apposite word for thinking about what is going on in the voice in DeLillo. And in some ways you've been talking about veering in other respects, this idea of the jump cut, or of going between two places, or shifting between different themes or perspectives. But what interests me, I suppose, and maybe this is a way of coming back to the term that was evoked earlier, but we haven't maybe said as much about it as we might want to, stream of consciousness. It seems to me that in DeLillo's writing, and this is also the irony and the humor, there is never only one voice, right? So we think about the importance of voice, but actually, however we construe it, however we figure it, there's a kind of veering in the voice, veering in what literary critics traditionally have called point of view, or focalization, which means that even when there is only supposedly one person speaking, it's never one voice, you know. And we can call it irony, we can call it telepathy, we can call it, I suppose, telephony as well. I mean, a kind of telephony as some sort of sharing, or hearty lining, or proliferation of voices. So this isn't a question, it's just a remark, I suppose. And where the dog comes in for me, if I can get back to the question of the dog, and I don't know if you've got anything to say about the dog. I saw a cat earlier on Chris's lap, but I've been recently reading, and I was in conversation actually with Ellen Sixu about Virginia Woolf's little book, Flush. And I don't know if people listening know Virginia Woolf's little book, Flush. But Flush is a book that she wrote after she'd practically gone crazy writing The Waves. And Flush is a book about a dog. And, you know, one of the things that seems to me to be really intriguing and arresting about that novel is that you have something like the voice of a dog, or the consciousness of a dog in the narrative. I've no idea what Chris had in mind when he first mentioned the dog, but this does seem to me to be, you know, a fascinating thing about DeLillo's writing. I suppose I've been most struck by it in relation to birds, actually, and birdsong, but the way in which consciousness in DeLillo is not limited to the human.
Thank you. Those are fantastic comments, Nick. Yeah, boy. I mean, Nick has written a lot about this notion of the veer, which appears, and you find it in 0K. It's the place in the convergence where everything seems to happen. It's the place of transition between life and this being alive and being in this state of suspended animation. It's kind of the place where a quasi natural organic becomes technologized because memory becomes transformed on the other side of the veer. So yeah, I would completely endorse the idea that the veer is the kind of interface between contrabanded notions, life and death, nature and culture. It's the place in between the two. It's obviously reminiscent of Lucretius, reminiscent of the veer that's at the origin of all things. As for animals and their consciousness, it's interesting. I'm not sure I find that necessarily in DeLillo. There are, you're right. There are lots of not a tremendous number of animals, but a certain number of animals, and particularly birds. I'm thinking of some of the opening pages of The Body Artist, where they provide the narrator with a real lesson of perception. It's only after the birds have taken flight that you actually see the birds that have taken flight. You hear something, there's a flutter, you look over, and then you realize that what you had seen without seeing was a pack of birds that were all leaving together outside the window of the this house in Maine, where the Lauren and Ray Robles are held up in that opening scene. There's a very interesting moment in Falling Men when someone says, as they're going down the staircase in the South Tower, not smoke everywhere. And then I think it's Florence Gibbons, something like, and then I saw a dog, and it was someone's probably service dog. And it was this very comforting thing, and we knew that the dog would somehow lead us out. So that's an interesting reference to dogs. Whether there's a notion of dog, of a kind of voice or consciousness that goes beyond the human and DeLillo, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. As for there being more than one voice in DeLillo, absolutely. I think that's absolutely the case. There are multiple voices, and they can't be necessarily enumerated. They can't be somehow laid out next to one another, but there are multiple voices.
I might just jump in with my dog story, which it actually involves two dogs. And I was going to remain quiet until you mentioned Lucretius, because one of the two dogs is named Lucrece, and the other one is named Sappho. And what happened, the reason I think of this is I was very interested in the way in which you were talking about doubling things presenting themselves in the image, becoming visible through the image, or things being filmed or being filmable. And it struck me that you were capturing something very, very crucial about modern experience. And at that point, I was remembering something that I had experienced once with these two dogs. I was it was a French farmhouse a little bit south of Grenoble, with a beautiful fireplace, big fireplace, and the two dogs were sitting by the fireplace. And I remember sitting there and looking, and then doing a double take, and I realized I felt that I was looking into a painting of Spanish royalty. These were two Breton Spaniels who looked like dogs that I had seen in paintings of Spanish royalty. And I really did a double take. I was just, I was kind of having trouble with my relation to reality at that moment, because it was so powerful, this image. Now, that's a painterly image, but I realized, of course, I'm seeing the dog en image, about in a kind of image that is sort of schematized my relation to dogs, to some extent. And then suddenly I was seeing the schema, and as opposed to just the dogs. And but the curious thing about that, one of the two dogs, that Sappho, is that Sappho, I would see her at certain points, and I would have the feeling that she wasn't quite in the same reality. And I actually have a picture where she seems to be floating. And I pointed this out to other people. I said, yes, there's something about Sappho quite present in the moment, or in the scene. But the reason I mentioned this is that it had to do with this. I think you're capturing this very modern effect of doubling in technology, and there is something maybe modern, postmodern about this that's different from what I think I was seeing in the fireplace with the painterly image. I think there's this kind of schematization of reality, and then this becoming image has changed for us in profound ways, and that DeLillo is capturing that or attending to that in important ways. So that was the basis of my dog reference there.
I think that makes sense. Yes, maybe one difference would be a difference between the repetition and that you see, or the representation in a Spanish painting, and the two dogs on the one hand, and then the kind of Andy Warhol repetition of a particular image, not just twice, but many, many times. So that notion of repetition that you find in Mao 2, for example, but in many other novels, as a result of technology and so forth, seems to do something different than, seems to change the nature of two, the twins, into something mechanically reproducible, iterable, and therefore more than two.
I just wanted to very quickly say that I had, the reason I mentioned Sappho also is that she had that illuminated presence, I think, that you seem fascinated by, because it comes up at certain moments, and it's like you want to get there, and you notice it at certain points, and you underscore it. And I'm very fascinated by that, the moments when you do underscore it, and what that is exactly.
Yeah, that's another aspect that we haven't even talked about. But at the end of, near the end of a DeLillo novel, there's not only a kind of a miracle, oftentimes related to something celestial, such as the Earth, Moon, Sun, or something triangular, or something tripartite, but usually some kind of radiance, some kind of illumination, almost always related to language, either a word that illuminates, or the word illumination, or the word radiance. Sometimes it can be objects, such as strawberries in the grocery store, or the radiance that happens after when it rains. But it's oftentimes related to the language itself, radiance of language itself. When language somehow, I don't know if I want to say reveals itself, but unfolds itself. And what that unfolding leads to, it seems, is a kind of radiance.
Wonderful. Well, it's almost 2 o'clock.
Yeah, this is just, I wanted to say that it's a good place to finish. I want to thank everyone who were here today. Especially I want to thank to Michael Naas for being here today with us, for devoting his time to discuss his work. And I hope that you enjoy it, and I hope that we will again see each other on May 16th. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
Everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.